The main story, of course, was in the Labour seats that fell to the Tories, and there were a lot of them in London and the South East, 15, because more voters in this part of the country opted for Mrs Thatcher than anywhere else. We have a 6.6% swing against a national average of only 4.9%. Certainly the biggest shock today was the defeat of Mrs Shirley Williams at Hertford and Stevenage. The outgoing Secretary of State for Education fell victim to an even bigger swing than the South East average, 8.1% in her case, but Labour's leading woman, who'd played such a major part in the national campaign, second only perhaps to Jim Callaghan himself, reacted calmly if ruefully.
What seems to me sad is that people vote so much more for their own position and their own situation than perhaps for the good of the country as a whole. And I think this result in the election is, I don't mean my own, but the national result, is a tragic one.
And what are you going to do now? What plans do you have for the future?
Give me a chance to sleep. I wouldn't dream of thinking about it in my present state.
The average swing was made to look positively puny, though, at Basildon, where Eric Moonman, the energetic MP since 1974, fell to Tory Harvey Proctor. Or maybe that's partly explained by Basildon's changing nature as a London overspill town. In Dartford, Tory Robert Dunn swept in on an 8% swing. In Ealing North, Bill Malloy, the defeated Labour candidate, had merely a 4% swing against him. Harry Greenaway, a deputy headmaster, beat him to it. In Enfield North, 28-year-old Tim Egger overturned a Labour majority of 4,000, and in Hornchurch, Robin Squire, one of the rising breed of successful young Tories, won the seat. A real surprise was Fulham, where Martin Stevens is the new Conservative MP. The National Front, incidentally, lost their deposit there. Gravesend and Hemel Hempstead went, they were both marginals, and in Ilford South the real voting figures matched almost exactly the sums we got from our opinion polls in that seat. Neil Thorne won it for the Tories.
Congratulations on your victory. First of all, can I ask you, were you at all surprised?
No, we've been working very hard and we got the result we anticipated.
Well, you have, of course, been a very senior politician on the GLC. And various people in your position have said to me, well, I'd rather be at the GLC because I have more political clout than on the back benches. Is this something that's going to worry you at all now?
No, not at all. I've been, my ambition has been to enter Parliament for the last 30 years, and I've now achieved my ambition.
In contrast, Paddington was a real cliffhanger. 4 recounts after it was discovered that there were 1,500 more ballot papers than were actually issued. But eventually, late this morning, defeat by a mere 100 votes for Labour's Arthur Latham. Putney was one of the first Labour seats to fall last night, the end of a career for Hugh Jenkins, who at 71 was privately quite keen to retire anyway. The victor, David Mellor, who's 30 and a barrister.
We always knew, and indeed I said at that meeting, that it was to Putney that Mrs Thatcher would be looking to see if she was going to be in Downing Street the following day, and we were determined not to let her down, and indeed we didn't.
Can I ask you very quickly, and really in a word, what was the real factor that tipped the scales?
That Labour had failed almost every section of the community in Putney. Although it's a very varied community, no one had done very well in the last 5 years, and I'm afraid they thought it was time for change.
Meantime, Peggy Fenner regained Rochester and Chatham, which he'd lost in 1974. Watford was something of a surprise. Tristan Garrell-Jones, in his second try for the seat, made it safe for the Conservatives. And with all those constituencies seized by the Conservatives, it was inevitable that Helene Hayman should lose in the very marginal Welwyn and Hatfield.
I'm desperately disappointed that we're going to have a Conservative government. But as I said, our job now is to start fighting to persuade people that we were right this time and we'll be right next time.
Many Conservatives in marginal seats made those seats safe. Barney Hayhoe in Brentford and Isleworth, for example, back with an increased majority.
It's a victory more than anything else for the great team of people of which I was lucky enough to be the champion on this occasion, the candidate.
And Ian Mikado in Bethnal Green and Bow had the opposite experience, in fact. In safe Labour East London, he had his majority sliced by the Liberal challenge. 14% swung their way.
It was a swing against the dustmen, who haven't collected the dust, and the maintenance workers, because there have been a lot of disputes in our borough council and whatnot. People were very browned off. All I got going around, they didn't talk to me about Liberal policy, Labour policy, Conservative policy. They talked about their stopped-up rubbish chutes, the piles of rubble in the streets not being collected, and their leaky taps. There are many indications that the big swing to the Conservative have been mostly on council estates. And that in itself, they are the people who suffer most when there is industrial disruption in local authority services.
Other Labour notables had a rather different explanation why so many traditional Labour voters actually opted for Mrs Thatcher in the end. Former Labour Chief Whip Bob Mellish.
And here is a lesson to be learned. There are millions of trade unionists who voted Conservative. Let's admit it frankly and freely, let's run away. And I think some trade unionists, leaders in particular, must ask themselves the question, why?
Some of them